everyone, and thank you for joining us today. If you've been, following up either my newsletter, you know that I do these webinars. Actually, we started on COVID, but we keep going. And all of them, what we have in common is that they're super informative and educational and about topics that we see in the news or in the industry. And I feel that I want to be updated and know things. And I assume that if I need that, more of my colleagues do. If we've never met before, my name is Nama Blonder. I'm an architect and urban planner with Smart Density. Rental replacement has been on the news, not positively necessarily, and also recently in council, Planning and Housing Committee, with some recent updates. So I reached out to the city and I invited them to present the recent updates, but also the foundation to make sure we're all on the same page, because this is a very sensitive and complex process, has been and will be. Graham Hines and Christine Ono are both from Strategic Initiative. Thank you very much for being here today. I will turn off my camera and mute myself, but I'm here to the audience. Please feel free to type your questions. I see all of them, and we'll do a short Q&A at the end. Okay, go for it, and thank you again for being here.
All right, thanks, Nama. I'm going to share my screen. I'll start off with a bit of high-level context and turn it over to Christine to talk about how our process is implemented. And then I'll finish up with a bit of a discussion about the current tenant assistance framework in place. I'm going to share my screen here. Right. So I'm going to start off with a bit of a land acknowledgement that we do here at the City of Toronto. And I want to put a bit of context to that as well. So we acknowledge the land we are meeting on is a traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I think just as I was thinking about the land acknowledgement in preparation for today, wanted to reflect on how housing is a key part of our reconciliation framework in Canada. And really, housing policy, as some people say, is all policy. Just like a couple quick things. Access to safe and adequate housing, including in our cities, is a key part, or is like one of the calls for justice by the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. It's often talked about as just like an important part of our overall, as I noted, reconciliation framework. A quick, easy read if you want to read up on some of this and some of the putting it all together I've shared here from Canada's Indigenous Watchdog. And as we think specifically about our rental housing policies, it's just important to also remember that First Nations and Indigenous populations in Canada are more likely to be renters. They have lower incomes. So looking at the numbers here in Toronto, about 48% of all households in Toronto are renters. That's 70% for our First Nations and Indigenous households, and their incomes are about 10% lower on a median perspective than everybody else in the city. So as we think about how we make our rental system work, I think it's important to keep in mind that it's also a big part of how we think about reconciliation and taking care of those of us who are here already and those that are future generations as well. So with that, also going to put the context of our rental policies in a bit of context here. I think some of the things we try to keep in mind as we're working on our rental policies, including the replacement policies, is we recognize that Toronto's growing very quickly and there is a need for new housing, including new rental housing. Alongside that, a lot of our rental housing is aging. It often needs significant repairs and or renewal. But as we deal with that, demolition does cause hardship and significant stress for tenants that go through that process. As an owner, when a developer comes to you and says, we want to redevelop your property, it's maybe a positive thing. The opposite is, often true when you're a renter. It causes a lot of stress. It's out of control. And, whether there's positive outcomes associated with it or not, it means you're going to lose your home and you don't really have control over that process. So as we think about this, as we think about our rental replacement policies, it's sort of this balance of we do need more rental housing, but we also want to make sure it doesn't, come so much at the cost of existing tenants. Some quick notes, just looking at the most recent rentals.ca Rent report for Toronto, a 1-bedroom today, average rent is $2,300. Sorry, there we go. Thank you, Kristen. Average rent for a 1-bedroom unit is $2,300. Average rent for a 2-bedroom unit is over $2,900. And according to the 2021 census, these are incomes for 2020. So a 30th percentile renter earned about $4,100. That would make rent of just over $1,000 affordable to them based on 30% of their income. The median renter household earns $64,000, meaning they can only afford $1,600. And the 80th percentile renter household earns about $113,000, so they can afford just over $2,800. Incomes have gone up about 15 to 20%, we estimate, since then. But as we can see, most renters can't afford average, like asking rents on the market, at least without being rent burdened. So with that, I'm going to go into a bit of the policy and practice framework for the city. So the city's ability to put permits or to control rental housing demolition comes from Chapter 667 of the Municipal Code. That's our rental housing demolition bylaw. And the authority for that bylaw comes from the City of Toronto Act. It's Section 111. And just one thing that's notable about this is it's not part of the Planning Act. It's part of the City of Toronto Act, as I noted, which means decisions about the conditions the city puts on to rental housing demolition are not appealable to the Ontario Land Tribunal. If you wanted to appeal decisions around a rental housing demolition application process, they have to go to divisional court. The way our bylaw works is we require a rental housing demolition application when 6 or more residential units, at least one of them being rental, is proposed for demolition. So you just need an application regardless in that situation. When there are 6 or more rental dwelling units being demolished, and they're not all what's classified as high-end units, we actually require rental replacement through our official plan policy. So our official plan speaks to a few things, and I think it links back to some of the context I spoke about. Is one, we want to stimulate the production of new private sector rental housing supply, but we also want to preserve our existing stock of affordable and mid-range rental housing, because we know, through turnover, through redevelopment, we are losing those rental units that are most affordable to those that need it. Specifically, we have our rental housing replacement official plan policy. It's policy 3216. And as I noted, when 6 or more rental units are demolished, if they're not all high-end units, you must replace all of those rental units with units of the same type and size. We're a little flexible on how we interpret that sizing in terms of replacing 100% of the GFA, but having some flexibility, maybe particularly around very large rental units that are being demolished, if we make that area up elsewhere. The rents in those replacement units are restricted for a period of at least 10 years. So the way we do that is we look at what were the rent classifications at the time of application and restricting them to similar rent levels in the future for anyone that signs a lease in that first 10 years of operation. And anyone that moves in those first 10 years, they also are protected by the guideline increases for as long as they remain a tenant, even if that extends beyond 10 years. Outside of that, we also secure the rental tenure of those units for at least 20 years, and we require that a tenant assistance plan, which we'll talk about later, be implemented for those tenants. Just earlier this spring, we introduced a new rental replacement handbook. I think this is really important as we think about how we do a better job, both as the city, as developers, as consultants, in terms of communicating how this process is supposed to play out. So this is meant to be a resource both for tenants and for property owners and the groups that they work with to help make our process and our requirements much more straightforward. We worked with a lot of stakeholders, with a plain language writer, to try to make this as clear and transparent as possible, and really outlines how the process is supposed to play out and the different expectations at different steps. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Christine now to talk about our current process and how we see rental housing demolition applications playing out.
Thanks, Graham. So I'll give a bit of an overview from kind of concept, pre-application stage, all the way up to keys where tenants are moving back into the replacement rental units. This first stage is really an optional step, our pre-application consultation stage. If there's a related rezoning or official plan amendment application, our team would provide comments on rental housing demolition and replacement requirements as part of that pre-application consultation. Otherwise, applicants are always welcome to reach out to our team to discuss application submission requirements. It's really a good practice to confirm existing conditions as soon as possible in the process. Our team will go on site and do a site visit to confirm the number of existing rental units, their unit type, and whether or not the existing units are occupied or vacant. When we do the site visit, if there are tenants kind of home at the time, we always offer our contact information, and that's the initial point of contact about with the city about the process. But really good best practice is to have that early and continued engagement between applicants, the city, and the tenants whose homes are being demolished as a result of the application. Here's kind of a really unique opportunity where applicants have the ability to consult early with the clients, the end users of their product before an application is even made. So we encourage kind of that initial consultation with tenants about kind of the expected timelines, the process, any tenant assistance and all of that. And we do have that handbook available now as a good starting point for those discussions. So next step would be the application submission. We do have a number of materials that are required to be submitted as part of a rental housing demolition application. The main one being this housing issues report, which is a publicly available document that really outlines a proposal for demolition and replacement of the rental units. It'll include kind of information about the tenant assistance plan and any consultation expected with tenants. We also require floor plans of the existing and replacement rental units to be submitted to the city for review in order us to consider the proposal in relation to the official plan policy requirements. As well, we require rent rolls to be submitted. And so we classified the existing rental units at different rent categories. Graham mentioned there's affordable, mid-range moderate, or high-end rental units. And these are really based off of rents at the time the application is submitted. So our team does issue notice of complete application once we've received all the information and we've deemed it complete. As part of the package that we send back to applicants, it includes a template for a notice that applicants are required to hand deliver to tenants impacted by the redevelopment to inform them of the proposal that an application has been made. It informs them of their rights and responsibilities as tenants and kind of the next steps in the process. As part of this package, we also provide applicants with a lease addendum. So it would be an addendum to a standard tenancy agreement. We always encourage applicants to lease out any vacant units as part of the application, kind of after the application has been submitted, if they're currently vacant. And if they do so, we encourage them to use this lease addendum to ensure that tenants who are leasing up units are aware that their unit has already been proposed to be demolished and are aware of their kind of rights and abilities and ability for tenant assistance under the RTA. Next slide. So I guess I'll note that the faster that we get all of those complete application requirements and that fulsome submission of application materials, the faster we are able to review the rental housing demolition application and bring it forward to council for a decision. Once we do have all those materials, we review the proposal against the OP policy requirements. So ensuring that all of the existing rental units are replaced by their same unit type. We also take a look at the floor plans of the replacement rental units to ensure that they're similar in function and form to the market units. So here's an example of maybe a floor plan where an applicant was looking to get 2 bedrooms with external windows. And as a result, we kind of end up with this really awkward hallway leading to a window in one of the bedrooms. I don't think that's something that we would typically see in a market rental or condo unit. And so we want to make sure that these units are functional for the people who are going to be living in them. We also look to ensure that the replacement units are similar in size to the existing rental units. So the handbook that Graham highlighted does include some additional details about our expectations for this. We do expect that 100% of the existing gross floor area of all of the rental units is replaced in the new building. Where there are kind of more unique circumstances, so like a number of house form buildings with really large units, we have outlined in the handbook that the replacement unit sizes could be reduced to line up with the city's growing up guidelines, which are urban design guidelines for family-sized units. And as part of our review of floor plans, we also look to ensure that the rental units are located in contiguous groupings of 6 or more rental units. So often we see the existing rental units replaced in an otherwise condominium building. Usually they're in the like the third story or the podium level of a new condominium building. What they are is stratified as a rental block outside of the actual condominium. And so we want to make sure that those rental units are located, touching side by side in contiguous groups of 6. Next slide, please. So once we do review the materials and are comfortable with that the rental replacement proposal is meeting the official plan policy requirements, our team will bring forward a report to council. Often it's under the same timelines if there's a related rezoning or official plan amendment application. So it would go to council at the same time, but under 2 separate reports. And then if council approves the application, it typically approves the application with a number of conditions that need to be met before the rental housing demolition permit is issued. And so if a report is approved by council, let's say in June, an applicant can't expect to go ahead and start demolishing the units the next week. There is kind of a number of steps and a process that needs to take place before demolition can actually proceed. One of the major steps is registering a Section 111 agreement between the owner of the property and the city that's registered on title, and it includes a number of requirements related to the replacement rental units and the tenant assistance plan. There's also kind of an established move-out process for tenants with a minimum notice period before they're required to move out. And the goal being that we're really lining up move out of the tenants with the start of construction, so tenants are able to stay in their home as long as possible until construction is ready to proceed. And next up. So construction is underway, and then about 6 months before the units are replacement rental units are ready to be occupied, we initiate kind of another move back process between the city, the applicant, and tenants. As part of this process, tenants receive kind of what's called an occupancy information notice, and they're able to choose their replacement rental unit based on their seniority. So tenants who had lived in their previous unit for the longest have the first choice of replacement rental units by unit type. As a new kind of check-in in this process, we are requiring applicants to submit the proposed replacement unit allocation to the city for review, just ensuring that tenant selection and seniority is lining up with the units that they've been assigned to before any leases are signed for the replacement rental units. If there are any replacement rental units without returning tenants that are to be rented at affordable or mid-range affordable rents, there is a separate process that is undertaken to ensure that those units are leased up to individuals and families that are actually in need of affordable housing. We have requirements around ensuring it is a kind of a public and transparent process. There's a random draw after prospective tenants have an opportunity to submit interest in leasing out these units. And I'll flag that the city is moving towards this new centralized affordable rental housing access system. It should be available by the end of this year or sometime next year, which will be really a one window portal for applicants to be able to lease up affordable rental units, as well as for tenants across the city to express their interest in these affordable units that they're eligible for. Next slide. And then beyond move back, for returning tenants, there are ongoing replacement rent conditions. So returning tenants are able to return to replacement rental units at rent similar to what they previously paid. The only differences would be annual increases that are allowed for by the provincial rent increase guideline. Any new tenants of replacement rental units, so not returning tenants, their rents would be set based on our official plan definitions. Our team updates those rents annually and posts it on the city's website at toronto.ca/planningforhousing. And we do that annually based on CMHC data. As well, for all rental units, there could be adjustments, so downward adjustments if tenants are being required to pay utilities on top of their rent. And for any tenant who moves in within the first 10 years of occupancy of a replacement rental unit, their rent can only be increased by the provincial rent increase guideline for the length of their tenancy. And so they're kind of secured at these kind of rent levels for the length of their tenure. After the first 10 years of occupancy, any new leases for new tenants who lease those replacement rental units won't have any rent restrictions on them. Okay, and I've kind of signaled some key check-ins with tenants throughout the process, but I wanted to take a moment in one slide to outline the minimum requirements for tenant engagement throughout the rental replacement process. So as I mentioned, tenants are notified of the demolition application. Usually it's within 14 days of the application being deemed complete by the city. There is a tenant meeting to discuss the demolition and replacement rental process before any decision is made by council. The city requires applicants to deliver notices to tenants of the community council meeting and council meetings, and tenants have an opportunity to provide comments to community council at that time. Tenants will also receive a notice when a decision has been made by council. And kind of in the spirit of increasing communication and transparency for tenants, and that's something that we heard a lot in consultations on our rental replacement process over the past year. We've made some additional check-in requirements for tenants throughout the process. So this includes biannual project updates. We heard a lot that tenants maybe were engaged in the process before a decision was made by council, but there was a lot of silence before move out occurred or before the replacement rental unit was ready to be occupied. So we do have that requirement now for project updates twice a year. We've also established 2 new tenant meetings, one at the time that tenants receive the notice to move out to discuss the move out process, and then again at the time that the tenants receive the notice to move back to discuss the move back process and that opportunity to sign new leases and select their preferred replacement rental units. And we've also built in another check-in through a tenant survey that occurs after tenants move out of their existing units. And so I'll pass it back to Graham.
All right, I'm just going to quickly go over the typical tenant assistance plan that's outlined in our handbook, and then try to leave a bit of time for discussion and questions. So quickly through our process, all tenants, whether they are an eligible tenant, meaning someone that was living in the unit before the demolition application was submitted, or if they moved in post and signed that lease addendum that Christine spoke about, get 6 months of notice before they're required to move out. This is as opposed to 4 that's secured under the Residential Tenancies Act. All tenants are also required to get the compensation under the RTA. And for most applications, that's typically equal to 3 months of their rent. We also look to secure special and needs assistance for anyone that's eligible. It's people with a documented medical condition or who are over 65. And it's really to help people who are going to have more struggles in the housing market make sure they're able to move out and actually find housing. Right now, that's calculated as 4 times average rent by unit type. So if you live in a 1-bedroom unit, you would get 4 times whatever the current average market rent is for a 1-bedroom unit. This is a bit of a change from our old process where it used to be calculated based on a tenant's rent, similar to the RTA compensation. But we wanted to try to make this a bit more equitable and make sure that regardless of your rent, you were getting the same compensation based on the type of unit you were living in. I also want to flag that we're actually going to be reviewing our overall process for vulnerable tenants this year, thinking about like what are the right supports and how do we make sure this process works for them and helps them move out and find housing, as A, that's an important thing to make sure they remain housed, and B, helping people successfully move out and find interim housing is a key sort of driver of making sure rental demolition projects can be successful. For tenants that were there before the application was submitted, there's additional compensation that is required. The primary one is what's called rent gap assistance, and I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. In addition, these tenants receive a moving allowance for each of their required moves. So first, the move out of the housing that's proposed for demolition, and then again for their move back into the replacement units once it's ready. Tenants that are in a studio or 1-bedroom unit receive $1,500 for each of those required moves. Tenants in 2-bedroom or larger units receive $2,500. As Christine noted, these eligible tenants have the right to return to the replacement building at similar rent. We also look to help support their move out of the existing building through a leasing agent if they request. So this is something the owner of the building would provide. This person should be helping them find and apply to units, help coordinate reference letters, things like that. Basically, we want to make this move out as seamless and as easy as possible for those tenants. About rent gap assistance, what this assistance is meant to do is it's intended to cover the difference between what tenants were paying in their existing units versus what they would be likely to pay in the market. It's calculated and provided as a lump sum when the tenant moves out. And what we do is we look at the difference between what a tenant is currently paying versus the CMHC data for average rent in rental buildings completed after 2015. And CMHC publishes this for 2 geographic districts. The first is zones 1 to 4 in Toronto, which coincides sort of somewhat with Old City of Toronto. It's Midtown, Downtown, a bit of West Toronto, a bit of East Toronto, and then zones 5 to 17, which covers the rest of the city. One of the things I'll note is, there wasn't enough data to publish studio rents for zones 5 to 17 and 3-bedroom rents for zones 3-bedroom rents for zones 5 to 17 this year. So in those cases, we would use the citywide data, but this data is reviewed and updated annually by CMHC every time they do their survey. And we would always use the most recent numbers published by CMHC whenever tenants move out. So with that, we do have our contact information here. And I'm just going to stop screen sharing and we can have some time to do a quick bit of discussion or questions.
Wonderful, right on time. Thank you so much. And thank you for that informative presentation. We do have some questions. We might not have time for everything, so I apologize in advance, but I will pick the most informative ones. So first of all, can you maybe speak to what is coming very briefly from provincial policy and what the City of Toronto has added?
Do you want to go ahead or do you want me to?
Sure. So the City of Toronto Act allows the city, like through the province, they allow the city to control the demolition of rental units. And so the city's rental replacement policy is that requirement for the units to be replaced and for tenants to be provided with that assistance. I'll note, though, that we've had our rental replacement policy in force since 2007. So it's not a new policy. It's been around, it's been implemented for over a decade, nearly 2 decades now. And so some of the changes that came to the Planning and Housing Committee last month were really tweaks towards the implementation of the policy, not new policy requirements itself.
Okay, and I see another question on the provincial guidelines. We might group it later. One other question. So, for example, the comparison to the growing up studies that guidelines, they had their percentage of the building and the unit size. And we know that over time, it's been 8 years, there's some flexibility on the unit size, but the percentage is really important. Here with rental replacement, is it the total what are you exactly looking, and what some flexibility you think with time we will find out? Is it the GFA per unit? Is it the total GFA of rental in the building? Is it because we know that those older units were much bigger than our market today. So what are you looking in terms of the one-to-one or the replacement?
So I think that the general policy is looking for similar sizes of units. So in the past, that often was, more strictly interpreted that if you had a 2,000 square foot unit, which should be replaced with a new 2,000 square foot unit, we recognized that was challenging. So part of what we did through this review was those really large units, we said we are okay for them to come down to the growing up guidelines. Those are guidelines the city's done that says this is a family sized unit that still functions for families. So it certainly can be a big downsize for a lot of households, but we wanted to make sure that the large units that were being delivered through rental replacement were more in line with the types of large units that might be delivered in a building. Now, obviously, there's still challenges. A lot of large units in new buildings don't meet the growing up guideline size requirements. We know that. But we do, we need to balance some of the livability concerns of, what type of housing did tenants have before, and make sure that they can still have a similar, setup in their new homes when they move into that rental replacement housing. As we both noted, we still look for 100% replacement. So if you took a 2,000 square foot unit and made that into like a 1,000 square foot 3-bedroom unit, we would also look to secure that 1,000 freed up as rental replacement, but we would have some flexibility to work with the developer around like, what are we going to do with that 1,000 square feet? And there can be some balance to that. Like those would be, we'd expect that additional space to be, market unit sizes instead of replacement unit sizes. So there's some flexibility to make sure we're getting good outcomes for the rental system in terms of that freed up floor area.
And I do want to defend the growing up, full disclosure, I did work on the original guidelines, but we now start to see how that policy or guidelines bring to market much needed family units. And we only see it now, right? Because the guidelines came in 2017, and now we can kind of harvest the fruit. So I think it's a great example. If you've been collecting data on how many eligible tenants actually return, I think that's a topic that it's on the international front. We just had a discussion about London, UK yesterday, about Elephant and Castle, like projects like, the major flagship of rental replacement. How when you look back, what did you find in terms of tenants actually return?
I think it's varied project by project, and it's not actually something we formally tracked across every single project. I think like on some that we have, it's in the past around 50%. Christine, I think, is a number we've thrown around. I think anecdotally we've recognized it's been higher in more recent applications. Part of what we do want to do through this more involved a tenant engagement process and follow-up surveys is actually get a better sense of those return numbers. So it is a metric we're looking to actually more formally capture moving forward. But anecdotally in the past, it's about 50%, but likely higher in more recent applications, particularly with the challenges in the current rental market.
For all the questions asking about the coffee and it is, you can go to Smart Density's YouTube channel and you can find it there live. It's there right now. Does the process apply to all rental units over 6, or would it be modified or simplified for rental buildings with closer to 7 units? I can maybe answer that. You just said 6. Then I will also add to it also if the units are vacant and even illegal. Is that correct? You can maybe correct me or answer that question in any way you want.
Go ahead, Christine.
Yeah, that's fair. And I think I also saw a question about 6, like house form single detached buildings. So if all of those homes were rental units, that would count as 6 rental units, and replacement would be required.
And rental as in dedicated rental, right? Like under the purpose-built rental.
That's right. So they can't be like it would not apply to a condominium unit that had been rented out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But as Christine noted, like it does apply to how like single detached houses if they were rented. So those aren't part of a purpose-built rental, but they would count as rent. Basically something with a resident, like with a lease, that would be covered by the Residential Tenancies Act and qualifies as a full unit versus a dwelling room or like rooming house unit.
Question about how do we get the handbook? I'm assuming it's accessible on the city's website.
So right now there's a draft version that council looked at this spring. We will be posting a more finalized version later this summer. Right now, sort of we're open to hearing feedback about that handbook and if there's ways we can improve the design, the communication within it, with the intent of, I would say, like June or early July at the latest, getting that online. We're also hoping to post a 2-pager that would be a bit more accessible and easier to like print out as a resource for people that summarizes the key information. So right now, you can access it through the council decision. If you search for rental handbook on the city council website, you should be able to find it. This summer, we should have it up on the same, Christine noted, the like Planning for Housing website where affordable rents are posted. It will be posted to that same website.
Okay. Maybe I'll pick one last question if that's okay. Has there ever been consideration by the city to keep rental replacement units rent controlled in the spirit of protecting long-term affordability? I'm assuming like the person who asked that question, I'm assuming you're asking like New York City style. I don't know, that's my add-on. Also, what's the rationale for not making the rental tenure requirement permanent?
I think a lot there. I'll start and maybe Christine can add to it if she has other thoughts as well. So I think one, the policy was developed with that 10-year affordability requirement. And I think, you know, as I noted at the start, this policy is about a bit of balance, right? Like how do we make sure rental housing can be redeveloped and renewed while also protecting what we did have in terms of affordable and mid-range housing and protecting the tenants that return. So as noted, anyone that moves in within 10 years does receive rent protections for as long as they remain a tenant. So if they stay for 30, 40 years, they would have those protections last forever. While someone who moves in after 10 years, there's no initial rent restrictions nor guideline increases. And I think like as we think about like the new Residential Tenancies Act requirements, which sort of says buildings completed after 2018 have no rent restrictions or guideline restrictions, it sort of strikes a bit of a balance that if you're a returning tenant or you're moving back into one of those affordable or mid-range units, it's important to sort of help maintain what we did have in those rent classifications. But long-term, you know, this is new housing and that does often rent at higher rates. So there should be an ability eventually to maybe move to those market rates, knowing that other older apartments hopefully will become more affordable as we build more rental supply. In terms of like making the tenure permanent, what I would note is like, even though the tenure is only specifically protected for 20 years, like anyone that wants to demolish or convert in the future would have to go through a full application as well. This doesn't mean you get to like automatically convert after 20 years. Like you would still have to go through this process again if you wanted to demolish or convert. Like our policy allows us to protect the conversion as well. So yes, it's only 20 years, but if there were still tenants in the affordable or mid-range housing units, we would likely be looking to protect or replace those units, you know, even after 20 years.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, I felt that was a good question to wrap it up. I will just say that we have a second part to this webinar next week. I just didn't want to overload so much information on one webinar, and I wanted to also give the city the time just for you to share the foundation and make sure that we cover the basics. But next week, it will be myself as an urban planner, and I will be joined by Samantha Martin, who is a communication expert, and Zoe Brown, who is a community engagement specialist. And it will be, my part, to be honest, will be very, very minor, because it's not really the planner who could make this a better process. My point is that you really need more help to, as I said, there's a human element at the core. This is not a typical development project, and I think our industry should treat it as well as we should. So I think that will be a very practical webinar next week. I put a link in the chat box. So hopefully I'll see you next week again. And for you, Graham and Christine, thank you so much for joining us today. I really do appreciate it, and your hard work as well. So thank you for that as well.